When the door clicked shut, he finally moved toward his desk, a slab of polished black marble that held nothing but a single fountain pen and a cold espresso. No photographs. No mementos. 3 years ago, he'd cleared every personal item from this space the morning after he'd walked out on Isabella. He'd told himself it was necessary. A clean break. A man building an empire couldn't be weighed down by sentimentality. But tonight, the emptiness felt different. Sharper. He sank into his chair and stared at the city lights blooming across the Hudson River. A memory surfaced unbidden: Isabella's laughter in their old Brooklyn apartment. The way she'd dance while cooking pasta, flour dusting her cheeks like freckles. She'd been 6 months pregnant then, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly as she whispered to their unborn child. "Your father's going to teach you how to build things that last," she'd said, her eyes shining with a faith he'd mistaken for naivety. His phone buzzed, a notification from a luxury watchmaker about a new limited edition timepiece. He swiped it away. What was the point of owning time when you had no one to share it with? Alexander Vance doesn't get lonely, he murmured to the empty room, the words tasting like ash. He'd built a billion-dollar tech empire by age 38. His face graced magazine covers. Strangers recognized his silhouette in airports. Yet he couldn't remember the last time someone had touched his hand without wanting something in return. A sudden, sharp pain bloomed behind his eyes. Not a headache, but something deeper. The ghost of a promise broken. He saw it again: Isabella standing in their doorway, suitcase in hand, her voice trembling but steady. "You're choosing a ghost over your own child. A rumor over your family." He'd believed the lie, that she'd been unfaithful. A single manipulated text message, sent by a rival who knew exactly which strings to pull. And Alexander, proud and wounded, had let it destroy everything. He'd left her that night. 3 years ago tomorrow. Now the city lights blurred as moisture gathered in his eyes. Tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. He pressed his palms against his temples, fighting the swell of regret that threatened to crack his carefully constructed composure. This office, this empire, this life, it was all a monument to a mistake. Every successful deal, every accolade, every silent dinner in 5-star restaurants served only to echo the question that haunted his sleep: "What have I become?" The intercom buzzed softly. "Sir, the car is ready for the Children's Art Gala. You're scheduled to present the keynote in 40 minutes. Alexander exhaled slowly, straightening his tie with practiced precision. The mask slid back into place, the confident tycoon the world expected. But as he stood to leave, his gaze fell on the window's reflection: a man in an expensive suit, standing utterly alone in a room full of light. And for the first time in 3 years, he wondered if redemption was possible. If somewhere in this vast city, a little boy with his eyes was learning to walk without ever knowing his father's hand to guide him. He picked up his keys, the metal cold against his skin. Tonight was just another charity event. Another performance. Or so he told himself as he stepped into the elevator, descending from his glass tower toward the streets below. Toward a chance encounter he couldn't possibly foresee, but that would unravel the careful lies he'd built his life upon. The doors closed with a whisper, sealing him in darkness for a moment, suspended between who he was and who he might still become. Certo. Agora atue como narrador e storyteller. Desenvolva a história sem marcações com o nome de cada tópico que for. Desenvolve. Me conte sobre o tópico 2 com diálogo como se eu fosse o espectador, sempre lembrando de desenvolver com muita emoção, com muitos sentimentos, de forma que a estrutura da narrativa utiliza uma linha temporal linear de modo o espectador sentir o que o personagem está sentindo. Em inglês, com 6.000 caracteres. Pensamento concluído. Descentem off turpentine and fresh. Basil hung in the warm air of their Brooklyn brownstone kitchen, a fragrance that, to Alexander, would forever smell like home. Isabella stood at the counter, her fingers dusted with flour as she rolled out pasta dough, humming a melody she'd composed that morning while teaching watercolors to 3rd graders. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the copper strands in her chestnut hair and illuminating the gentle curve of her smile. "You're burning the garlic again," she said without turning, her voice a soft laugh wrapped in affection. Alexander looked down at the sizzling pan, startled. He'd been watching her, the way her shoulders moved as she worked the dough, the quiet concentration in her eyes. "I was distracted," he admitted, turning off the burner. "You have flour on your nose." She turned then, and the world narrowed to the space between them. Her eyes, warm hazel flecked with gold, crinkled at the corners. "You're supposed to be the tycoon who notices market fluctuations before they happen. How do you miss flour on my face every single time? Because when I look at you, he said, stepping closer, everything else goes out of focus. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a summer porch, and reached up to wipe his cheek with her flour-dusted thumb. Liar. Last week you noticed I'd changed my shampoo. Because it smells like peaches. He murmured, catching her wrist gently. And peaches remind me of that orchard in Georgia where we got lost for 3 hours. Because you refused to use GPS. Because I wanted more time with you. He pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing her in flour, basil, and the faint lavender soap she loved. Remember what you said when we finally found the road? Isabella leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Getting lost was the best part of the trip. I meant it. She looked up, her gaze turning serious. Alexander, promise me something. Anything. When you build that empire of yours, don't let it build walls between us. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. I don't care if we live in a penthouse or this little brownstone. I just want us to keep cooking dinner together. To keep getting lost on purpose. He cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. Isabella, you're the only destination I've ever wanted to reach. And in that moment, he meant it with every fiber of his being. This woman, this artist who saw beauty in cracked sidewalks and taught children to find colors in rain puddles, had softened the sharp edges he'd spent 35 years forging. With her, success wasn't measured in stock prices, but in quiet evenings like this one, where the only negotiation was who got the last meatball. They'd met 2 years earlier at a gallery opening he'd attended only to appease a client. While others discussed acquisitions and portfolios, he'd found himself drawn to a corner where Isabella stood before a canvas splashed with indigo and gold. It's the color of twilight over the ocean, she'd explained when he approached, not recognizing him as the Vance of Vance Technologies. Not the moment the sun disappears, but the breath after. When the sky holds its breath between day and night. He'd been captivated not by her beauty alone, but by the way she saw the world, as something alive with meaning. He'd returned to that gallery every Thursday for a month, pretending to appreciate art while really learning the rhythm of her laughter, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her hands moved when she spoke about teaching underprivileged kids to paint their dreams. Their first real date wasn't at a Michelin-starred restaurant, but at a community garden where she volunteered. He'd worn a suit. She'd handed him a trowel and a pair of muddy gloves. The earth doesn't care about your title, she'd said, her eyes dancing. It only cares if you're willing to get your hands dirty. He'd never felt more alive. Now, as they sat at their small wooden table sharing steaming plates of handmade pasta, Alexander reached across and laced his fingers with hers. I had a meeting today with the board, he began softly. They want me to take the company public next quarter. Isabella stilled, but didn't pull away. And what do you want? I want. He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like betrayal. I want to build something that lasts. Something our children can be proud of. Our children. The words hung between them, tender and full of promise. Isabella's eyes glistened. She brought his hand to her lips, kissing his knuckles slowly. Then build it, she whispered. But build it with your heart still in your chest, Alexander. Not locked in a vault somewhere. Later that evening, they sat on their fire escape wrapped in a quilt, watching fireflies blink like distant stars over the Brooklyn rooftops. Isabella rested her head on his shoulder. I dreamed about our baby last night, she said quietly. Alexander's breath caught. They'd only recently started trying. What did you see? A little boy with your eyes, she murmured, but my stubbornness. He was building a tower of blocks taller than himself, and when it fell, he just laughed and started again. She turned to him, moonlight tracing the delicate line of her profile. That's what I want to give him. Your resilience and my joy. A heart that knows how to fall and still find reasons to rebuild. He held her tighter, pressing his lips to her hair. We'll give him everything, he vowed, the words swelling with a love so vast it frightened him. A home filled with art and music. A father who comes home for dinner. A mother who teaches him to see magic in ordinary things. In that suspended hour between night and dawn, with the city breathing softly around them, Alexander Vance believed, truly believed, that love was the only empire worth building. He didn't know then how fragile such moments were. How a single lie, carefully planted like poison ivy in a garden, could strangle even the strongest roots. He didn't know that in 6 months, he would walk away from this woman carrying his child, blinded by pride and a manipulated text message that would cost him 3 years of sunsets, 3 years of bedtime stories, 3 years of a little boy learning to say dada to an empty room. But on this night, none of that existed. There was only Isabella's hand in his, the scent of basil on the air, and the quiet certainty that some loves were meant to anchor you, not weigh you down. As the first light of dawn painted the sky and stirred beside him, her hand instinctively finding his in the darkness. "Go back to sleep," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple before slipping from bed. In the hallway, the blue glow of his screen illuminated the tension in his jaw. It was Marcus Croft, his CFO and oldest friend. "Alex, I'm sorry to wake you. The Singapore board just sent revised terms. They're demanding you relocate for 6 months minimum to oversee integration. No exceptions." Alexander's knuckles whitened around the phone. "We agreed I'd commute. 2 weeks on, 1 off. The deal collapses without full presence on the ground. You know this." Marcus's voice dropped, laced with something unfamiliar. Urgency bordering on fear. "And there's chatter, Alex. Whispers that you're getting soft. That family life is diluting your focus." From the bedroom doorway, Isabella watched him, her silhouette framed by warm lamplight. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked the question that would haunt him for years. "What are they asking you to sacrifice the next morning over coffee?" Alexander tried to soften the blow. "It's temporary," he said, stirring honey into her chamomile tea the way she liked it. 6 months in Singapore. I'd fly back every 3rd weekend." Isabella's spoon stilled mid-stir. "The baby's due in 5 months." "I know, and I'll be here for the birth. I've already cleared my schedule for the entire month of June." He reached for her hand, but she gently withdrew it to rest on her belly, now noticeably rounded beneath her linen dress. "Alexander," she said softly, "do you remember what you promised on our fire escape about building with your heart still in your chest?" "I'm not breaking that promise. This merger secures our future. It means stability for our child." "Stability isn't measured in offshore accounts," she interrupted, her voice trembling not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "It's measured in presence. In showing up." She looked down at her hands. "My father was a diplomat. He missed my first steps, my first day of school, my graduation. He sent beautiful gifts from embassies around the world, but I grew up learning to set the table for one." The words landed like stones in Alexander's chest. He wanted to argue, to explain how this deal would protect them from ever-knowing financial uncertainty. But the truth was, he'd already begun rearranging his internal compass toward the boardroom's demands. The pressure had been subtle at first, sideways glances when he left the office at 6 p.m., pointed questions about his availability during critical negotiations. Now it had crystallized into an ultimatum disguised as opportunity. That afternoon, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Central Park, the full weight descended. 12 directors sat in silence as Marcus presented the Singapore proposal. When the slides concluded, Eleanor Reed, the iron-willed chairwoman who'd mentored Alexander since his 20s, leaned forward, her silver hair catching the light like a crown of thorns. "Alexander," she began, her voice deceptively gentle, "you've built something extraordinary here. But empires aren't maintained by men who clock out for piano recitals." A few directors shifted uncomfortably. "This merger isn't just business, it's legacy. And legacies require sacrifice." Her gaze flickered toward the window, toward the world beyond. Even the ones that hurt. After the meeting, Alexander stood alone in the empty room, staring at his reflection superimposed over the city skyline. He saw a man caught between two truths: the boy who'd sworn on a Brooklyn fire escape to build a different kind of life, and the tycoon whose name now carried expectations heavier than gold. His phone buzzed, a photo from Isabella. Her hands cradling her belly, a single sunflower resting beside them on their quilt. The caption read, "He kicked today." Felt like a tiny heartbeat saying hello. Tears pricked his eyes. He typed 3 words, "I love you," then deleted them. What good were words when his actions were already pulling him away? He typed again, "Can we talk tonight? Something important came up." Her reply arrived instantly always. But that evening, as he rehearsed his explanation over a bottle of whiskey in his study, another message arrived. Not from Isabella, but from an unlisted number. A single image loaded slowly on his screen: Isabella, laughing with a handsome man outside a cafe he didn't recognize. Her hand rested lightly on the man's arm. The timestamp read yesterday, during the hours she'd told him she was grading art projects at school. The whiskey turned to acid in his throat. His thumb hovered over her contact, ready to demand answers. But pride, that ancient poison, coiled around his heart. She knew I was in negotiations. She knew the stakes. The thought slithered in, venomous and seductive. What if her resistance to his Singapore assignment wasn't about the baby at all? What if it was about him? He didn't call her, didn't ask for context. Instead, he poured another drink and let the seed of doubt take root. A seed carefully planted by a rival who understood that the strongest walls aren't built with bricks, but with silence and suspicion. When Isabella finally entered the study, her face radiant with anticipation, he couldn't meet her eyes. "Alexander, you said it was important." He stared into his glass, the amber liquid reflecting a fractured version of himself. The board approved the merger. Full relocation. 6 months minimum. Her breath caught a soft, wounded sound. "And the baby, I'll be here for the birth. I promise." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. She crossed the room slowly, kneeling before his chair until their eyes met. Moonlight from the window haloed her hair. "Look at me," she whispered. "Tell me you're not running away from us. Tell me this isn't about that photo someone sent you." His blood ran cold. What photo? Tears welled in her eyes. "I got a message too. Anonymous. Showing you having dinner with a woman at Le Bernardin last week." She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "I deleted it. Without looking twice because I trust you." "Why can't you trust me in that moment?" Alexander stood at the edge of a cliff. One step toward her, toward truth, toward vulnerability, and he might save everything. But the ghost of that fabricated image haunted him, and the board's expectations pressed down like a physical weight. He saw Eleanor Reed's disappointed face, heard the whispers about his softening, felt the terrifying prospect of being perceived as weak. So he chose pride over love, ambition over presence. He stood abruptly, pulling his hand from hers. "It's not about a photo, Isabella. It's about responsibility. Some of us have obligations beyond this brownstone." The words were weapons he never thought he'd wield, and the moment they left his lips, he saw the exact second her heart broke. Not dramatically, but quietly, like a teacup cracking under sudden pressure. She didn't cry out, didn't scream. She simply rose, straightened her dress, and walked toward the bedroom. At the doorway, she paused without turning back. "You're not choosing responsibility," she said, her voice barely audible. "You're choosing fear. And our child deserves better than a father who confuses the two." Alone in the study, Alexander sank back into his chair as rain began to fall against the windows. He reached for his phone to call Marcus, to demand answers about the anonymous message, but stopped himself. What if the truth was worse than the lie? What if she had been with that man? The uncertainty became a cage, and he locked himself inside willingly. 3 days later, as Isabella packed a small suitcase with quiet efficiency, Alexander stood in their bedroom doorway, paralyzed by a grief he couldn't name. She zipped the bag shut and turned to him, her eyes clear and calm. "My sister has a guest room in Vermont," she said. "The air is clean there. Good for the baby." "Isabella, please, no more words, Alexander." She picked up her bag, then hesitated, placing a hand on her belly. He kicked again this morning. Stronger this time. A single tear traced her cheek. "I told him it was just his father's heart, trying to find its way home." And then she was gone. The brownstone fell into a silence so profound Alexander could hear his own pulse. A frantic, lonely drumbeat counting down the moments until he would realize, too late, that empires built on sacrifice often crumble from within. That night, as he sat alone at their kitchen table surrounded by the ghosts of shared meals, he finally opened his laptop and typed a single search query into the browser: how to prove a text message was fabricated. But by then, the door had closed. And some doors, once shut, require more than keys to reopen. They require a man willing to dismantle the walls he built around his own heart. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean while leaving his soul stained with the first irreversible choice of many. Somewhere beyond the skyline, a woman carried his child into an uncertain future, and Alexander, he burst onto the Brooklyn sidewalk just as her taxi turned the corner, its red taillights bleeding into the rain-slicked street. "Isabella." His voice shattered the night, raw and desperate. But the cab didn't slow. He stood there in his bare feet, the cold pavement biting his soles, watching until the lights disappeared into the city's pulse. Back inside, the house felt like a museum of their love. He wandered room to room. The kitchen where she'd taught him to knead dough, the living room where they'd painted the walls sunset orange together, the nursery they'd started preparing with secondhand furniture and dreams. His hand trembled as he picked up the ultrasound photo taped to the fridge, a grainy black and white swirl they'd named Little Star. Due in 5 months. 5 months he'd just traded for a boardroom in Singapore. His phone buzzed incessantly, Marcus Eleanor, his assistant, but he silenced it all. Instead, he dialed Isabella's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again. On the seventh attempt, a soft voice answered, thick with tears he'd put there. "Alexander, where are you? I'll come get you. Right now." A shaky breath. "I'm at the train station. Heading north. Then stay there. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Alex." Her voice broke. "Why didn't you ask me about the photo? Why didn't you trust me?" The question hung between them, sharp as shattered glass. He opened his mouth, to apologize, to explain the pressure, to beg, but pride coiled in his throat like a serpent. What if she lies? What if the photo was real? The doubt, carefully planted by unseen hands, had taken root. "I need to think," he whispered, the words ash on his tongue. Silence stretched, fragile as a spiderweb. Then, softly, "Thinking is what we do when we've already decided." "Isabella, please." The line went dead. He stood there in the empty kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone until his arm ached. Rain lashed the windows. Somewhere beyond the glass, his future was boarding a train alone. 3 days later, Alexander sat across from Eleanor Reed in her corner office, the city sprawling beneath them like a kingdom of broken promises. She slid a contract across the polished desk. Singapore. Immediate departure. Full authority over the merger. Her eyes, sharp as flint, held his. "The board needs to see you're still the man who built this company from a garage. Not the man who lets sentiment dictate strategy." He stared at the document, the ink bold, final. "I need to be here for the birth." Eleanor's smile was thin, surgical. "Men like us don't attend births, Alexander. We build legacies that outlive us. Your child will have everything money can buy. That's a father's real duty." His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Isabella's sister in Vermont. "She's settled. Quiet. The baby moves constantly, like he's searching for you." Below it, a photo: Isabella sitting on a porch swing, one hand resting on her belly, gazing at distant mountains. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a sorrow that reached through the screen and gripped his heart. "Sign it," Eleanor urged, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Prove them wrong. Prove her wrong. Show everyone that Alexander Vance doesn't break." He thought of Isabella's words on the fire escape, "Don't let it build walls between us." He thought of the anonymous photo. Had he ever really questioned its authenticity, or had he welcomed the excuse to retreat into the familiar fortress of work? His pen hovered over the signature line. That evening, he found himself standing outside Isabella's sister's Vermont farmhouse as dusk painted the hills in violet and gold. He hadn't called, hadn't warned her, just driven north for 4 hours with a single white gardenia, her favorite, clutched in his hand. He saw her first through the kitchen window, humming softly as she chopped vegetables, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. The sight unraveled him. This was what he was walking away from. Not a distraction from his empire, a foundation for a different kind of strength. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles could touch wood. Isabella stood there, her eyes widening. Not with anger, but with a quiet devastation that cut deeper than rage. She wore his old college sweatshirt, the sleeves swallowing her hands. And for a heart-stopping second, he thought she might step into his arms. Then she saw the suitcase behind him. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question. 6 months, he choked out. The merger is a choice, Alexander. Not a sentence." She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture over their child. "I got a call today from your office. They confirmed your flight to Singapore leaves tomorrow morning." He flinched. "I was going to tell you," when from 30,000 feet a single tear traced her cheek, but her voice remained steady. "You had 3 days. 3 days to call, to text, to show up at this door and say I was wrong. Instead, you went to sign papers. I'm trying to secure our future. Our future was right here." Her hand swept toward the kitchen, the half-prepared meal, the ultrasound photo taped to the fridge. "You keep calling it a sacrifice. But real sacrifice is staying when it's hard, not running when you're scared." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He saw it then, the manipulation, the manufactured crisis, the way his pride had been weaponized against him. But admitting it meant admitting he'd been played. Meant admitting he'd failed her without even fighting. "I can't lose this deal, Isabella. Everything I've built means nothing if you lose yourself," she finished softly. "And you're already halfway gone." He reached for her, his voice breaking. "What if I come back? What if I fix this?" She looked down at her belly, then back at him. her eyes glistening with a love that refused to die even as it bled out. Come back when you realize that some things can't be fixed with money or apologies. Come back when you understand that showing up isn't an option. It's the entire point. She closed the door gently, not with anger, but with finality. He stood on the porch as night fell, the gardenia wilting in his hand. Inside, a floorboard creaked, the sound of her walking away. And in that moment, Alexander Vance made the choice that would haunt him for 3 years. He turned toward his car, toward the airport, toward the empire waiting to consume him whole. He didn't look back. But as he drove away, a single text lit up his phone. A message he'd never sent, drafted and deleted 100 times. I love you. I'm sorry. Wait for me. He never pressed send. Somewhere behind him, in a quiet Vermont kitchen, Isabella placed a hand on her belly and whispered to their unborn son, "Your father's lost right now." But love always finds its way home. She didn't believe it yet, but she spoke the words anyway, a prayer into the gathering dark, hoping they might become true. Simply embracing, businessmen barking into phones. He stood apart from it all, a ghost in a tailored suit, his boarding pass for Singapore clutched so tightly the edges bit into his palm. His phone vibrated for the 17th time that hour. Marcus. Eleanor. His assistant. He ignored them all. Only one contact mattered now, and her name sat untouched on his screen, Isabella. Her last message still glowing. Come back when you understand that showing up isn't an option. It's the entire point. He'd driven through the night from Vermont, the gardenia she'd left wilting on his passenger seat, its petals falling like silent accusations onto the leather upholstery. At 4 a.m., he'd pulled over at a rest stop off I-91, the eastern sky bleeding into pre-dawn gray. He'd typed a message with trembling fingers, "I'm boarding the flight. But I'll be back before June. Before he's born. Wait for me." He stared at the words until they blurred, then deleted them. What right did he have to ask her to wait? He'd chosen a ghost over flesh and blood, a manipulated image over the woman who carried his child. The truth was, he wasn't leaving to save the business. He was fleeing the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known, of having someone see the cracks in his armor and love him anyway. It was easier to be a tycoon in Singapore than a failing husband in Vermont. Final boarding call for Flight 227 to Singapore. The announcement sliced through the terminal's hum. Alexander's breath hitched. This was it. The point of no return. He pulled up Isabella's contact one last time. His thumb hovered over the call button. Just 1 minute of her voice. One chance to hear her say his name the way she used to, like a prayer, not a wound. But fear coiled in his chest, cold and familiar. What if she doesn't answer? What if she says don't come back? Better to leave with the fantasy of reconciliation than face the reality of her rejection. Pride, that ancient poison, whispered, let her miss you. Let her realize what she's lost. He powered off his phone. As he walked toward Gate B14, his mind replayed their final conversation in Vermont. Not the words, but the spaces between them. The way her hand had trembled when she touched her belly. The quiet devastation in her eyes when she realized he was truly leaving. He'd mistaken her calm for indifference, but now he understood she wasn't angry. She was grieving. Grieving the father their child would never know. The jet bridge loomed ahead, a sterile tunnel to another life. Sir, a young gate agent blocked his path gently. Your boarding pass shows first class, but are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Alexander forced a smile that felt like a fracture. I'm fine. Just leaving something important behind. The agent's eyes softened with a wisdom beyond her years. Then maybe you shouldn't. For a heartbeat, Alexander wavered. He could turn around. Call a car. Drive back north through the rising sun. Beg on her porch until she opened the door. But the ghost of Eleanor's voice echoed in his skull. Men like us don't break. We build legacies. I have to go, he whispered, more to himself than to her. He stepped onto the jet bridge. With each footfall, the world he knew receded, the scent of rain on Brooklyn streets, the weight of Isabella's head on his shoulder as they fell asleep watching old films, the dream of a little boy with his eyes learning to say dada. The hatch sealed behind him with a hydraulic sigh, and in that moment, Alexander Vance didn't just board a plane. He buried a part of himself alive. 12 hours later, disoriented by time zones and grief, he stood in his Singapore penthouse, a sterile expanse of white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Marina Bay. The city glittered below, a constellation of ambition, but all he saw was the empty space beside him in the king-sized bed. His assistant had left a welcome package on the desk, local SIM card, merger documents, a single red rose. Beneath it, a handwritten note: "Welcome to Singapore, Mr. Vance. The board expects daily updates. Your first meeting is at 7 a.m. sharp." He tossed the note aside and powered on his phone. 37 missed calls, 22 voicemails, and one text from Isabella, sent 6 hours ago. 3 hours after his plane had taken off. "The doctor says he's healthy. Strong heartbeat. He kicked twice during the ultrasound. I told him it was his father's heart, trying to find its way home. I hope it's still beating." Alexander sank to his knees on the cold marble floor, the phone clattering from his hand. He pressed his forehead against the glass wall, tears finally breaking through the dam he built over 3 days. They came silently at first, then in ragged sobs that echoed in the empty apartment. A tycoon brought to his knees not by market crashes or hostile takeovers, but by the quiet truth in a woman's words. He'd thought leaving would prove his strength. Instead, it had revealed his deepest weakness: the inability to trust love when it demanded everything. That night, as Singapore's skyline blazed beyond the glass, Alexander made a decision that would define the next 3 years. He wouldn't call her, wouldn't text, wouldn't send money or gifts that could be mistaken for payment rather than penance. He would earn his way back, not with grand gestures, but with the hardest currency of all changed behavior. He would master the merger, secure the company's future, then return, not as a savior bearing gifts, but as a man who'd learned that empires built on absence crumble faster than those built on presence. He picked up his phone and typed a single message to Marcus: "Investigate the anonymous photo sent to me 3 days ago. Find its origin. I need to know who did this, and why." Then he deleted Isabella's text thread before he could reread it and break completely. Some wounds needed to stay raw to heal properly. As dawn painted the Singapore sky in shades of rose and gold, the same colors that had bathed their Brooklyn fire escape, Alexander Vance sat at his desk and began his exile. Outside, the city awakened to commerce and ambition. Inside, a man began the long, silent work of becoming worthy of forgiveness. He didn't know it yet, but 3 years from this moment, he would stand in a sunlit room filled with children's artwork, and a little boy with his eyes would drop a wooden block at his feet, and the universe would offer him a second chance wrapped in tiny, trusting hands. But tonight, there was only the hollow echo of a door closing, only the ghost of a gardenia's scent, only the unbearable weight of a choice made not in anger, but in fear, and the dawning realization that some distances cannot be measured in miles, but in the space between a father's hand and his child's first steps. The city glittered on, indifferent to the quiet tragedy unfolding in a penthouse high above its streets. A man who owned everything, yet had just surrendered the only thing that ever truly mattered. And somewhere across the world, beneath Vermont's outside, the world was hushed beneath a blanket of white. But inside, life pulsed with a rhythm all its own. "He's dancing tonight," Isabella murmured, placing Clara's hand on the taut curve of her belly. A firm kick answered instantly, then another, a staccato rhythm against Clara's palm. Clara's eyes glistened. "He's got your spirit. And your stubbornness." She squeezed Isabella's shoulder gently. "You don't have to stay here forever, you know. Mom's guest room is always open." Isabella shook her head, watching snowflakes catch the lamplight like falling stars. "This is where I need to be. Quiet. No reminders." She traced the rim of her mug. "I dreamed about him last night, the baby. He was building a tower of blocks, just like I told Alexander he would. And when it fell, he didn't cry. He just looked up at me and laughed." Clara hesitated. "Has he reached out?" "Not since he boarded that plane." Isabella's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the mug. "And I won't check. If he wants to find us, he knows how." 3 weeks later, as maple sap began to run and the first crocuses pierced the thawing earth, Isabella stood in the doorway of a sunlit apartment above a bookstore in Burlington. The space was small, just one bedroom, a kitchen nook with a window box already sprouting basil, and a living area where afternoon light pooled like honey on wide plank floors. But it was hers, paid for with savings she'd quietly set aside during her teaching years, before Alexander's wealth had made her feel like a guest in her own life. "This is perfect," Clara said, unpacking a box of children's books Isabella had collected over the years. "But are you sure about the school? It's challenging." Isabella ran her hand over the windowsill, already imagining crayon drawings taped there. "The Oakwood Community School needs an art teacher who sees potential in every child, not just the ones who can afford private lessons." She turned, her belly now heavy and low. "That's the kind of mother I want to be. and the kind of teacher Lucas will know me as. The birth came on a rain-swept April evening, in a birthing center surrounded by the scent of lavender and the steady rhythm of Isabella's breathing. When Lucas emerged, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that blinked open to study the world with solemn curiosity, the midwife placed him on Isabella's chest and whispered, "He has your mouth." But those eyes, those are his father's. Isabella's breath caught. She traced the curve of his cheek with a trembling finger. "Hello, my love," she whispered as he rooted instinctively toward her heartbeat. "Welcome to the world." In that moment, grief and joy braided together so tightly she couldn't separate them. She cried, not for the father who wasn't there, but for the miracle in her arms. For the fierce, terrifying love that had already rearranged her entire universe. 6 months later, autumn painted Burlington in flames of crimson and gold. Isabella knelt on a patchwork quilt in their apartment's living room, guiding Lucas's chubby fingers to smear blue paint across thick paper. He babbled happily, his entire body wiggling with concentration. "Look at you, artist," she cooed, wiping a streak of cerulean from his nose. "Your first masterpiece." He responded by grabbing the brush and attempting to eat it, dissolving into giggles when she gently redirected his hand. In that laughter, bright and unburdened, Isabella found her redemption. Every sleepless night, every lonely dinner eaten one-handed while rocking a fussy infant, every moment she'd wondered if she was enough. It all dissolved in the face of this tiny human who looked at her as if she hung the moon. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A notification from a financial advisor confirming the modest trust fund she'd set up for Lucas using her teaching salary and careful investments. No lavish gifts from a distant father. Just security built with her own hands. Dignity earned, not given. Ms. Isabella, a soft knock preceded 8-year-old Maya, one of her students, peeking through the doorway of Isabella's after-school art corner at Oakwood. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of Lucas reaching for a crayon. Can I hold him?" Isabella smiled, settling Lucas on her hip. "Only if you promise to support his head." She guided Maya's small hands beneath Lucas's neck, and the girl's face transformed with wonder as Lucas gurgled and grabbed her finger. "He's so soft," Maya whispered. "Everyone starts out soft," Isabella said gently, watching the connection bloom between them. "It's the world that tries to make us hard. Our job is to stay soft anyway." Later that evening, as Lucas slept in his crib surrounded by handmade mobiles of painted birds, Isabella sat at her small desk grading drawings. A knock at the door surprised her. Past 8 p.m., visitors were rare. She opened it to find Mr. Henderson, the school principal, holding a bouquet of late-season sunflowers. "I heard you turned down the district's offer to teach at the private academy," he said without preamble. "Double the salary. Half the hours." Isabella stepped aside to let him in, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Oakwood is where I'm needed." He set the flowers on her table, his gaze sweeping the cozy room. The children's artwork taped to every wall, the well-loved books stacked beside Lucas's crib, the single-framed photo on. The mantel, Isabella and Lucas laughing in a park, dappled in sunlight. No man, no shadow of absence, just fullness. "You've built something beautiful here," he said quietly. "In 6 months, this place has become a sanctuary for those kids. They come early just to sit with you before class." Isabella looked toward Lucas's room, where a night light cast a gentle glow. "I'm just teaching them what my mother taught me, that beauty exists everywhere if you know how to look." Mr. Henderson hesitated at the door. "There was a man asking about you last week. At the school office. Tall, expensive coat. Didn't give his name, but he lingered near the playground after dismissal." Isabella's breath stilled. 4-3 heartbeats. The world narrowed to the space between hope and fear. Then she smoothed her hands over her apron, where paint stains bloomed like wildflowers. "Did he have my son's eyes?" she asked softly. Mr. Henderson studied her face, the absence of panic, the quiet strength. "He did." She nodded, turning back to her grading. "Then he knows where to find us when he's ready to stay." After he left, she walked to Lucas's crib and knelt beside him, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and sleep. His chest rose and fell in the ancient rhythm of trust. She pressed a kiss to his temple. "He's out there somewhere, my love," she whispered, learning what it means to come home. Outside, a lone street lamp cast long shadows across the quiet street. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a man in a Singapore penthouse stared at a grainy photo on his laptop. Security footage from Oakwood's playground, Time-stamped 3 days ago, a little boy with dark hair chasing bubbles, his laughter silent but unmistakable. Alexander's finger hovered over the print button, his throat tight with a truth he could no longer deny. He'd spent 3 years building an empire. But the only kingdom that mattered was waiting for him in a sunlit apartment above a bookstore, held together by a woman's quiet courage and a child's unwavering faith. And for the first time since boarding that plane, Alexander Vance allowed himself to imagine what forgiveness might feel like. Not as an ending, but as a beginning. Tripled the company's valuation. Silenced every doubter on the board. Yet each victory tasted like ash. Every midnight in that sterile penthouse, he'd pull up the same security footage on a private server, a boy with his eyes chasing bubbles across a playground, arms outstretched toward a joy he couldn't name. "Mr. Vance, the car is ready for the Children's Art Gala," his assistant's voice filtered through the intercom. "The Oakwood School event begins in 40 minutes. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, watching raindrops race down the glass like tears the city refused to shed. Tonight's event was mandatory, a public relations necessity after his 3-year absence. The Oakwood Community School's annual fundraiser, where Vance Technologies would announce a $1 million arts education grant. He'd approved the donation without reading the proposal. Only this morning had he noticed the fine print hosted at the Grand Meridian Hotel, featuring student artwork from Oakwood's after-school program. His blood ran cold. "Reschedule," he'd told his assistant, voice tight. "Send the CFO." "Sir, the board insisted you attend personally. After 3 years away, they want the public to see you're re-engaged." Now, standing in the back seat of the town car as it glided through Manhattan's glittering arteries, Alexander felt the weight of every mile traveled since that Vermont porch. He'd spent 36 months becoming the man Isabella deserved. The man who understood that showing up wasn't optional. He'd investigated the anonymous photo, discovered Marcus Croft's betrayal, the manipulated image engineered to sabotage the merger and seize control, confronted him quietly, removed him from the company without scandal, all while never reaching out to Isabella, because pride had finally transformed into something pure respect. She'd asked him to return when he understood, and he wouldn't come back with empty promises, only with proof, in his hands, his actions, the quiet spaces between his words. The Grand Meridian's porte cochere glittered under crystal chandeliers. Paparazzi flashes erupted as Alexander stepped from the car, his charcoal suit absorbing the light like a promise. He moved through the crowd on autopilot, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, his smile a carefully calibrated mask. Inside the ballroom, children's artwork covered every surface, vibrant finger paintings of suns with smiling faces, clay sculptures of animals with lopsided grace, watercolors where blue oceans bled into green forests without apology. "Mr. Vance." A small voice cut through the murmur. He turned to find a girl of 7 or 8 tugging his sleeve, her eyes wide with awe. In her hands, a painting on thick paper, a family of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a rainbow. The father figure wore a tiny tie. "This is for you," she whispered. "Ms. Isabella said you'd like it." The world tilted. "Ms. Isabella. Where is Ms. Isabella?" His voice emerged as a rasp. The girl pointed toward the far end of the ballroom, where a cluster of children gathered around a low table. "She's helping Lucas with his blocks." Lucas. The name struck his chest like a physical blow. He hadn't let himself speak it aloud in 3 years, afraid the sound would shatter whatever fragile hope remained. Now it hung in the air between them, real and breathing. He moved through the crowd as if underwater, each step heavier than the last. Past donors sipping champagne, past board members nodding approval. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down to a moment he'd dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. And then he saw him. A little boy with dark hair sat cross-legged on a Persian rug, completely absorbed in building a tower of wooden blocks. Sunlight from a nearby window caught the curve of his cheek, the exact same curve Alexander saw each morning in his own mirror. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration, tongue peeking between his lips. When the tower wobbled, he didn't cry. He simply steadied it with careful hands and added another block, his small shoulders set with a determination that stole Alexander's breath. "He's got your resilience," Isabella's voice echoed from a memory 3 years old. "And my joy." Alexander stood frozen 10 feet away, unable to move closer, afraid to breathe too loudly and shatter this fragile reality. He watched as Lucas placed the final block, a red cube, at the tower's peak. For 3 perfect seconds, it stood tall, Then gravity won. The tower collapsed in a clatter of wood. Alexander braced for tears. Instead, Lucas threw his head back and laughed, a sound like wind chimes dancing in a spring breeze. He gathered the blocks with joyful abandon, already planning his next creation. In that laughter, Alexander heard the echo of every bedtime story never read, every scraped knee never kissed better, every whispered I love you that had gone unheard. Grief rose in his throat, hot and suffocating. Again, Lucas chirped to no one in particular, stacking 2 blocks with solemn focus. Tears blurred Alexander's vision. He took one unsteady step forward, then another. His expensive Italian shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. He knelt slowly, keeping his distance, giving the child space to notice him, or not. Lucas glanced up. His eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold, widened not with fear but curiosity. He studied Alexander's face with the unself-conscious intensity only children possess. Then, without a word, he pushed a blue block toward him across the rug. Alexander's breath caught. He looked at the small hand, the trusting gesture. This was it, the threshold. One choice here would echo for a lifetime. He could retreat, maintain the distance he'd created. Or he could reach for the block, reach for his son. His hand trembled as he extended it. Not for the block, but to steady the wobbling tower Lucas was building anew. His fingers, usually so sure in boardrooms and on keyboards, moved with infinite gentleness. Triangles make strong bases, Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer contain. See, like this. He demonstrated with 2 blocks, forming a stable foundation. Lucas watched, then mimicked the motion with surprising precision. When their fingers brushed reaching for the same yellow block, the contact sent a current through Alexander's entire body, a recognition deeper than DNA. This was his son. Not a concept, not a regret. A living, breathing boy who laughed when towers fell and offered blocks to strangers. Again Lucas asked, his voice a soft melody. Alexander nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He added a block to the growing structure. Then another. Their hands moved in silent concert. Father and son building something together for the first time. The tower rose higher than before, steadier. Around them, the gala continued, champagne flutes clinking, donors laughing. But Alexander heard none of it. There was only the whisper of blocks meeting blocks. The soft rhythm of his son's breathing. The terrifying, beautiful fragility of a second chance taking shape between his hands. And from across the room, hidden behind a pillar draped in ivy, Isabella watched, her heart breaking and mending in the same breath, as the man who had left her pregnant knelt on a ballroom floor, teaching their son how to build something that might actually last. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. 3 years of lonely nights. 3 years of answering, "Where's my daddy?" with gentle truths. 3 years of wondering if he'd ever come back, not as a provider, but as a father. Now he was here, not with flowers or apologies, but with his knees on the floor and his hands building alongside their child. She took one step forward, then stopped. Let him have this moment. Let him earn the right to look up and meet her eyes. Let him understand that some doors don't reopen with a turn of the knob, but with the patient, trembling placement of a single block upon another. The tower stood now, 8 blocks high, a fragile monument to everything lost and everything still possible. And as Lucas reached for the final red block, the same one that had crowned his first attempt, Alexander finally looked up. His eyes found hers across the crowded room. Time stopped. In that suspended second, 3 years collapsed into a single breath. The Vermont porch, the Singapore penthouse, the empty brownstone, all of it funneled into this gaze. The first honest look they'd shared since he'd chosen fear over faith. Isabella didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply held his gaze, her eyes asking the only question that mattered after all this time. "Are you here to stay?" Alexander's answer came not in words, but in action. He turned back to Lucas, placed the red block gently atop the tower, and whispered words only the boy could hear. Words that carried the weight of 3 years of regret, and the fragile the word didn't come as a question of identity, but as a quiet offering, a child's instinctive recognition of something familiar in a stranger's hands, in the way he'd steadied the blocks, in the shape of his smile when the tower stood tall. Alexander froze. The world narrowed to the space between his son's lips and his own thundering heart. He hadn't earned that word. Not yet. But in Lucas's eyes, there was no judgment. Only the pure, unguarded trust of a child who saw kindness and named it what it was. Not yet, buddy, Alexander managed, his voice cracking like thin ice. But I'd like to be. Lucas studied him for a long moment, those deep brown eyes. His eyes, exactly his, searching with an intelligence that belied his 3 years. Then he reached out and pressed his small palm against Alexander's cheek. The touch was feather-light, warm with the heat of childhood, and it unraveled something ancient and broken inside him. In that contact, memory flooded Alexander with the force of a tidal wave. He was 7 again, sitting alone in a boarding school common room while other boys were collected by fathers who tousled their hair and asked about their week. He'd pressed his own small hand against the cold window pane, tracing the silhouette of a family in a car below. Father driving, mother laughing, child waving from the back seat. He'd made a silent vow then, if I ever have a son, I will never let him wonder if he matters. And yet here he was, 3 years absent, 3 years of bedtime stories missed, 3 years of first steps witnessed only through security footage on a laptop screen in Singapore. Tears welled hot behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall in front of his son. Instead, he covered Lucas's tiny hand with his own, his large, boardroom-polished fingers engulfing the child's soft ones. The contrast was devastating, the hands that signed billion-dollar deals now trembling beneath the trust of a boy who didn't know he'd been abandoned. "You have my eyes," Alexander whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "And my mother's stubborn chin." Lucas giggled, delighted by the attention. He pointed to Alexander's tie, a deep burgundy silk. "Red like my block." "Yes," Alexander choked out. "Exactly like your block." From across the room, Isabella finally moved. Her footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, but Alexander felt her approach like a change in atmospheric pressure, a shift in the very air he breathed. He didn't turn. Couldn't. His entire being was focused on the small weight of Lucas's hand against his face, on the fragile bridge being built between them block by block. She stopped 3 feet away. He caught her scent first, lavender and beeswax, the same fragrance that had haunted his Singapore apartment for 3 years. Then her shadow fell across the rug, softening the light around them. "Lucas," she said gently, her voice a melody he'd replayed in his dreams 1,000 nights. "It's almost time to go home." The boy didn't look up. "Building with Mr.," he announced proudly, adding another block to their tower. "He knows triangles." Isabella's breath hitched, a tiny, wounded sound Alexander felt in his bones. He finally turned his head, meeting her gaze fully for the first time in 1,095 days. Time collapsed. She looked older, not in years, but in resilience. Fine lines fanned from the corners of her eyes, etched not by sorrow, but by laughter shared with their son. Her hair was shorter, practical for chasing a toddler, but the copper strands still caught the light the way they had on their Brooklyn fire escape. She wore a simple dress the color of sage leaves, and around her neck hung a single silver locket he'd given her their first Christmas together. She'd kept it. After everything, she'd kept it. "Isabella," he breathed, the name a prayer on his lips. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her posture remained straight, unbroken. "You found us." I never stopped looking. The truth of it hung between them, raw and unvarnished. He hadn't searched with detectives or private investigators. He'd searched in boardrooms at 2 a.m., wondering if she was tucking their son into bed. He'd searched in airport lounges, imagining her teaching art to children who needed beauty. He'd searched every time he looked in the mirror and saw the ghost of the man he'd been before pride stole his family. Lucas, sensing the shift in energy, turned to his mother. "Mama, he's nice." The simple declaration shattered Alexander completely. He watched Isabella's composure fracture, a single tear tracing her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. She knelt beside Lucas, her movements fluid with the grace of 3 years of motherhood. "I know he is, my love," she murmured, tucking a strand of hair behind Lucas's ear. Then she looked at Alexander, her gaze piercing through the carefully constructed armor of the Tycoon. "But nice isn't enough anymore. Not after 3 years." "I know," he whispered. "I know it isn't." A silence stretched between them, not empty, but heavy with everything unsaid. The gala swirled around them, champagne flutes clinking, donors laughing, a string quartet tuning instruments, but they existed in a pocket of suspended time, the 3 of them kneeling on a Persian rug, as if the entire universe had narrowed to this single, fragile moment. Lucas, oblivious to the emotional earthquake beneath him, carefully placed the final red block atop their tower. It stood 8 blocks high, taller than his first attempt, steadier, more intentional. He clapped his hands together, his laughter ringing like bells in the space between his parents. Again he asked, looking from Alexander to Isabella with equal parts hope and expectation. Alexander's throat tightened. He looked at Isabella, not as the woman he'd wronged, but as the mother of his child, the architect of this boy's joy, the keeper of his first words, his first steps, his first heartbreaks. "May I?" Alexander asked softly, the question hanging in the air like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. "May I build again with him?" Isabella studied him. The genuine tears in his eyes, the absence of defensiveness, the way his entire body was angled toward their son as if drawn by gravity. She saw the man who had left her pregnant on a Vermont porch. And she saw, beneath the tailored suit and the Tycoon's composure, the boy who had once promised on a fire escape to build with his heart still in his chest. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over both of theirs, Alexander's large, weathered fingers and Lucas's small, paint-stained ones, resting on the wooden tower they'd built together. The contact sent a current through all three of them, a silent acknowledgement that some fractures, though deep, might still hold the weight of a future. "His bedtime is 7:30, she said quietly, her eyes holding Alexander's with a mixture of caution and something dangerously close to hope. "He likes stories about brave animals." Alexander's breath caught. An invitation. Fragile as a spiderweb. Precious as breath. "I know a story about a lion who was afraid of his own roar," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's building anyway, even when your tower might fall." Lucas's eyes widened with delight. Lion Alexander nodded, his gaze never leaving Isabella's. A lion who spent 3 years learning how to roar again. Tears finally spilled down Isabella's cheeks, quiet, unashamed. She didn't wipe them away. She simply let them fall as she watched the man who had broken her heart kneel patiently beside their son, showing him how to place one block upon another with hands that had finally learned the difference between building empires and building a home. And in that moment, surrounded by children's artwork and the ghosts of 3 lost years, Alexander Vance understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding, that with the adrenaline of closing billion-dollar deals, but with the terrifying vulnerability of a man standing at the edge of everything he'd thrown away. He watched his son with a hunger that felt physical, memorizing details no photograph could capture, the way Lucas's dark eyelashes fluttered when he concentrated, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow from a tumble off a playground slide Isabella had once texted him about, a message he'd read in a Singapore boardroom and deleted without replying. Then a little girl with braids stumbled nearby, her clay sculpture of a bird collapsing into a shapeless lump. She burst into quiet sobs, shoulders shaking. Without hesitation, Lucas abandoned their block tower and toddled toward her. He didn't speak, just stood before her, his small face serious. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth blue stone, placing it gently in her palm. "For sad," he murmured, patting her hand with solemn tenderness. The girl's tears slowed. She clutched the stone like a treasure. Alexander's breath caught. Where did he learn that? Not from him. He'd never taught his son the language of comfort. But Isabella had. In 3 years of solo motherhood, she'd woven empathy into the fabric of this child's soul, the very quality Alexander had spent a lifetime starving for. A memory surfaced, sharp as broken glass, himself at 7, watching a classmate cry after dropping his lunch tray in the cafeteria. Alexander had stood frozen, wanting to help but not knowing how, his own father having taught him that vulnerability was weakness. He'd walked away, the boy's sobs echoing in his ears for weeks. That moment had calcified something in him, the belief that connection required risk, and risk invited pain. So he'd built walls instead. Walls that had kept him safe from hurt, but also from love. And now here was his son, offering a stone to a stranger's tears without a second thought. The contrast was devastating. Lucas hadn't inherited his father's emotional armor. He'd inherited Isabella's open heart. And in that inheritance, Alexander saw both his greatest failure and his only hope. "Lucas shares his treasures," a soft voice said beside him. Isabella had returned, kneeling quietly at his side. She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on their son, who was now helping the little girl rebuild her clay bird with patient hands. "He gets that from you," Alexander whispered, the words raw with awe. A faint smile touched her lips. "He gets his quiet observation from you. Watch how he studies her hands before he helps. That's all you." Alexander watched, truly watched, as Lucas mimicked the girl's motions. pressing clay between small palms, shaping wings with careful thumbs. The boy wasn't just comforting, he was learning, absorbing her grief and transforming it into shared purpose. In that moment, Alexander saw not just a child, but a mirror reflecting the man he might have been if someone had shown him how to hold space for another's pain. "He asked about you last week," Isabella said softly, still not meeting his eyes. "Out of nowhere. We were reading a book about lions." He pointed to the father lion and said, "Where's his daddy?" Alexander's throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him his daddy was learning how to be brave." She finally turned to him, her hazel eyes glistening. "I didn't lie. I didn't villainize you. I just left the door open. Because Lucas deserves to know his father isn't a ghost. He's a man who made a mistake." Tears blurred Alexander's vision. He looked at his son, Lucas, his name is Lucas, now carefully placing a twig for the bird's beak. This child had spent 3 years constructing a father from absence and storybooks, and still offered stones to crying strangers. The weight of that grace crushed him. "I investigated the photo," he said suddenly, the confession tearing from him like a splinter. "The one that made me leave. It was Marcus Croft. He manipulated the image to sabotage the merger. He wanted control of the company." Isabella went very still. "I know. You know I had my sister's husband, a cybersecurity expert, trace the metadata 3 days after you left." Her voice remained calm, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped her knees. "I knew it was fake the moment I saw it. The cafe in the background, it's in Queens. I was grading papers at school in Brooklyn that afternoon. But by the time I tried to call you..." She shook her head, a single tear escaping. "You'd already decided I was guilty." The truth landed like a physical blow. She'd known. She'd tried to reach him. And he'd been too proud, too wounded, to answer her calls. "Why didn't you tell me later?" he choked out. When you could have what?" She interrupted gently. "Sent money, hired nannies, Alexander. I didn't need your resources. I needed your presence. And you weren't ready to give that." She gestured toward Lucas, who was now leading the little girl toward a table of glitter and glue. "Look at him. He's not broken. He's whole. Because I chose to build a beautiful life with the absence, not wait for you to fill it." Her words weren't bitter. They were factual, a quiet testament to a strength he'd never possessed. Lucas turned then, his face lighting up as he spotted them. He ran toward them, arms outstretched, not toward Isabella, but toward Alexander. He skidded to a stop inches away, holding up a lopsided clay bird with one wing larger than the other. "For you," he announced, pressing the damp sculpture into Alexander's palm. "Bird sad. Now happy." The clay was cool and slightly gritty against Alexander's skin. He cradled it like a relic. This imperfect, lopsided bird, made by his son's hands, was worth more than every acquisition he'd ever signed. "He made that for the little girl first," Isabella murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But when he saw you watching him, he made another. Just for you." Alexander looked from the clay bird to his son's expectant face. The same face that had stared back at him from ultrasound images 3 years ago. In Lucas's eyes, he saw no accusation, no memory of abandonment, only the pure, unguarded hope of a child offering a gift. And in that moment, Alexander Vance, the tycoon who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, felt the last of his defenses crumble. He wasn't being offered forgiveness. He was being offered something far more precious, a chance to earn it. Block by block, stone by stone, bird by imperfect, beautiful bird. He reached out slowly, giving Lucas time to pull away. When the boy didn't flinch, Alexander cupped his small shoulders, feeling the delicate bones beneath his palms. The architecture of a life he'd almost missed entirely. "Thank you," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Lucas beamed, then turned to Isabella with sudden urgency. "Mama, tell him the story. The one about the lion who got lost." Isabella's eyes met Alexander's across their son's head, a silent conversation passing between them in a single glance. "This is your moment," her gaze seemed to say. "Don't break it." Alexander took a shaky breath. He shifted to sit cross-legged on the rug, making himself small. Not the towering tycoon, but simply a man on the floor with his son. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice softer than it had been in years, "there was a lion cub who thought he had to roar louder than everyone else to be loved." And as he spoke, weaving a story of a lost cub finding his way home through kindness rather than strength, Alexander felt something shift deep in his chest. The first fragile crack in the wall he'd built around his heart 3 years ago. Lucas listened, rapt, his small hand resting trustingly on Alexander's knee, and half-finished champagne flutes and children's artwork. But Alexander remained on the rug, his son's head now heavy against his shoulder, the clay bird still clutched in his palm like a sacred relic. His bedtime was 20 minutes ago, Isabella murmured, kneeling beside them. She didn't reach for Lucas immediately. Instead, she watched Alexander's hands, how they cradled their son's back with a tenderness that contradicted every boardroom rumor about the ruthless Tycoon. He never falls asleep with strangers. Alexander's throat tightened. I'm not a stranger. Not to him, she corrected softly. To me. The words hung between them, not as rejection but as truth. He had become a ghost in her life. A name she whispered to their son at bedtime. A photograph she kept face down in a drawer. And now here he was, solid and breathing, holding the child they'd made together while the city glittered beyond the ballroom windows. Lucas stirred, mumbling in his sleep. Daddy Lion, home. Alexander's breath hitched. He looked at Isabella, his eyes pleading without words. Let me carry him. Let me do this one thing right. She studied him. For a long moment, the genuine tears glistening in his eyes, the absence of performative charm, the way his entire body had softened into a vessel of pure presence. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. His coat is on the chair by the door. The blue one with dinosaurs. Alexander rose slowly, Lucas cradled securely against his chest. The boy didn't wake, just nuzzled deeper into the unfamiliar but safe harbor of his father's shoulder, one small hand fisted in Alexander's silk tie. As Alexander walked toward the coat, he felt the weight of his son, not just physical, but sacred. This was the weight he'd traded for boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. This was the empire he'd abandoned. He returned with the tiny blue coat, its dinosaur scales worn soft from countless washes. With infinite care, he draped it over Lucas's sleeping form, tucking the edges around his small frame. The gesture was instinctive, a father's hands remembering a language his mind had forgotten. Your car or mine? Isabella asked quietly, gathering their things. Mine has a car seat, he said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He'd had it installed 6 months ago after seeing a child safety campaign, a silent, desperate hope he'd never voiced aloud. Blacktown car by the porte cochere. Driver named Robert. He's been with me 15 years. He'll understand. They moved through the nearly empty ballroom in silence, Alexander carrying their son, Isabella walking half a step behind. At the exit, she paused beneath the crystal chandelier, its light catching the tears still drying on her cheeks. Alexander, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If you hurt him, if you disappear again after tonight, I will never forgive you. Not for my sake. For his. He stopped, turning to face her fully. Lucas sighed in his sleep, his breath warm against Alexander's neck. I know, Alexander said, the words raw with conviction. And you shouldn't. But I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I'm asking for a chance to earn it. One day at a time. Starting with driving my son home. The town car waited under the hotel's porte cochere, rain misting the Manhattan streets beyond. Robert, an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, opened the rear door without a word. But when he saw Alexander holding a sleeping child, his professional composure faltered. Just for a second. A flicker of recognition. Of hope. Master Lucas, Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he secured the car seat. Your father has spoken your name every night for 3 years. Even when he thought no one could hear. Alexander's breath caught. He'd never realized Robert knew. Never realized his grief had been witnessed in those silent Singapore nights when he'd stare at the ultrasound photo on his desk and whisper his son's name into the darkness. Inside the car, Lucas stirred as Alexander buckled him in. His eyes fluttered open, drowsy, confused, then focused on Alexander's face hovering above him. Up he murmured, reaching small hands toward Alexander's face. Alexander's heart shattered and remade itself in that single gesture. He leaned closer, letting Lucas's fingers trace his jaw. The same gesture the boy had made hours earlier on the ballroom rug. Yes, buddy. We're going up. To your home. Your home too, Lucas asked, his voice thick with sleep. The question landed like a physical blow. Alexander looked to Isabella in the front seat, her reflection visible in the rearview mirror. Her eyes closed, a single tear tracing her cheek. Not yet, Alexander whispered to his son, his voice breaking with truth. But I'm learning the way. Lucas considered this with the solemn wisdom of children. Then he patted Alexander's cheek. Okay, learn fast. As the car pulled into Manhattan's glittering arteries, Alexander remained in the back seat beside his son. Lucas fell asleep again within minutes, his head lolling against the car seat window. But Alexander didn't move. He simply watched, the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, the way his eyelashes cast tiny shadows on his cheeks, the dinosaur scales on his coat catching the passing streetlights like constellations. Isabella turned in her seat, her gaze softening as she watched Alexander memorize their son's sleeping face. "He loves triangles," she said quietly, "and the color blue, and stories that end with everyone finding their way home." Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes in the dim car light. "What else should I know?" She hesitated, then began. A quiet litany of 3 years he'd missed. He's allergic to strawberries. He sleeps with a stuffed elephant named Barnaby. He says please before he even knows what he's asking for. He gets your stubbornness when building block towers, but he gets my patience when they fall. Her voice trembled slightly. He asks about you sometimes. Not often, but when he does, he always says the same thing. What does he say? Isabella's eyes glistened. I hope my daddy is learning to be brave. The words unraveled Alexander completely. He looked down at his sleeping son, the child who'd spent 3 years constructing a father from absence and hope, and understood the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. And the miracle of what was being offered now, not a clean slate, but a chance to build something new atop the ruins of his pride. The car turned onto a tree-lined street in Brooklyn. Familiar brownstones glowing with warm light behind lace curtains. Not Vermont. Not a temporary refuge. Home. She'd returned to their city. To the neighborhood where they'd once dreamed of raising children. Here, Isabella said softly as the car slowed before a brownstone with flower boxes spilling crimson geraniums. 3rd floor. The blue door. Alexander unbuckled Lucas with practiced care, lifting him into his arms once more. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his small arms wrapping instinctively around Alexander's neck. As Alexander stepped onto the sidewalk, rain began to fall, gentle droplets catching the street lamps' glow like scattered diamonds. Isabella led the way up the brownstone steps, her key turning in the lock with a soft click. Inside, the apartment unfolded like a living poem, walls adorned with children's artwork, a well-loved sofa draped with a quilt Isabella had sewn during her pregnancy, the scent of lavender and old books hanging in the air. And in the corner, a small wooden table set for 3, with a child's chair between 2 adult ones. You set an extra place, Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella didn't turn from hanging her coat. I always do. Just in case. In Lucas's bedroom, a sanctuary of soft blues and wooden toys, Alexander laid his son gently in a crib adorned with hand-painted stars. Lucas sighed in his sleep, his fingers uncurling from Alexander's tie. For a long moment, Alexander simply stood there, watching the steady rhythm of his son's breathing, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. When he turned to leave the room, Isabella stood in the doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Rain tapped softly against the window pane. You can stay for tea, she said, her voice barely audible. Downstairs. 10 minutes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to move back in. It was a single, fragile thread thrown across the chasm of 3 lost years. A thread Alexander would have to grasp with both hands and hold with everything he had. He nodded, his eyes glistening. 10 minutes. As he followed her downstairs, he glanced back once at his sleeping son, the boy who'd offered him a lopsided clay bird and asked him to learn fast. And in that glance, Alexander Vance made a silent vow that would reshape the rest of his life. I will learn. Not for the boardroom, not for the empire, but for the small hand that trusted me enough to fall asleep in my arms. I will learn to be brave. Ceramic mugs on the counter. The same mugs they'd bought together at a Brooklyn flea market 5 years ago. The blue one with the hairline crack Alexander had tried to glue back together the morning after their first real fight. Chamomile, she asked without turning, her voice carefully neutral. Or do Tycoons only drink single origin pour over? Now Alexander stood awkwardly in the doorway, his expensive suit absurdly out of place amid the warm clutter of this home. Isabella's home. The scent of rain clung to his shoulders, mingling with the lavender steam rising from the kettle. Chamomile is fine, he said softly. It's what you always made me when I couldn't sleep. She froze for half a heartbeat, just long enough for him to notice. Then she poured the water, the steam fogging her glasses. I remember. They carried their mugs to the small wooden table, the same table where he'd once proposed with a ring hidden in her favorite pasta dish. Now it held only 2 steaming cups and the ghost of everything they'd built together. For a full minute, neither spoke. Alexander watched her hands, how they cradled the mug the way they'd once cradled his face, how a faint scar traced her thumb, from the night she dropped a glass when he'd told her about the Singapore relocation. He'd been too consumed with his own anxiety to notice she'd cut herself. Too busy packing his suitcase to fetch a bandage. Why now? Alexander, the question came softly, but it carried the weight of 3 years. She finally looked up, her hazel eyes stripped of all pretense. Not I'm sorry. Not I missed you. Just, why now after 1,095 days of silence? After every birthday, every fever in the night, every time he called another man daddy at the playground because he didn't know what the word meant for him. Her voice didn't break. It deepened with a sorrow so profound it seemed to pull the air from the room. I tried to call, he whispered. The first week in Singapore. Your number went straight to voicemail. Because I changed it, she said flatly. After the 7th unanswered call from your assistant asking if I'd received the settlement documents. As if our marriage was a hostile takeover. I never sent settlement documents. But you sent silence. That was worse. She set her mug down with a soft click. Do you have any idea what it's like to explain to a 2-year-old why his father doesn't answer his drawings? Lucas would make you cards. Crayon lions with wobbly manies. And I'd take pictures to send to your office. Your assistant always replied with a generic, Mr. Vance appreciates the artwork. As if my son was a vendor sending holiday greetings. Alexander's throat closed. He'd never known. Marcus must have intercepted everything. Another layer of the betrayal he'd been too blind to see. I didn't know, he choked out. Marcus Croft, my CFO. He was sabotaging our communication. I only discovered it 6 months ago when I stopped. Isabella's hand lifted, palm out. Not in anger, but in exhaustion. I don't care about Marcus Croft. I don't care about boardroom politics or corporate espionage. I care that when my water broke at 3 a.m., I drove myself to the hospital because the man who promised to hold my hand through labor was building an empire on the other side of the world. A single tear escaped, tracing the curve of her cheek. I care that when Lucas took his first steps, he reached for empty air where his father should have been. The words landed like physical blows. Alexander bowed his head, tears finally spilling freely down his face. Hot, shameful, long overdue. You're right, he whispered, his voice raw. Every word. You're right. And yet here you are, she continued, her voice trembling now. Kneeling on a ballroom floor like it erases 3 years of absence. Offering stories and block towers as if fatherhood is a performance you can master in one evening. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing through his tears. Do you think I haven't dreamed of this moment of you walking through that door with your heart in your hands instead of your pride? But dreams don't prepare you for the man who actually shows up. The man who has to prove day after day after day that he won't disappear again when the next merger demands his soul. Alexander reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. I'm not asking you to trust me tonight. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for the chance to show up tomorrow. And the day after that. However long it takes. However long it takes for what she challenged, her eyes glistening. For Lucas to stop flinching when tall men approach him, for me to stop holding my breath every time you look at your phone during dinner, for us to believe that love isn't just something you abandon when it gets complicated. The apartment fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against the window. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, Lucas stirring in his sleep. Both their heads turned instinctively toward the sound. 2 parents bound by a love that had survived even their worst failures. I loved you, Alexander said quietly, the words hanging in the steam between them. I was just too afraid to believe I deserved to be loved back. That photo, it confirmed every insecurity I'd carried since I was a boy watching my own father choose work over bedtime stories. I thought if I left first, I wouldn't have to feel the pain of being left. Isabella's composure finally fractured. A sob escaped before she could stifle it. You didn't just leave me, Alexander. You left him. And no amount of regret changes the fact that our son learned to say daddy to an empty room. I know. His voice broke completely. And if I could go back, if I could trade every dollar I've earned since that day to sit beside you in that delivery room, to hear his first cry, to change his first diaper, I would. In a heartbeat. But I can't. All I have is tonight. And tomorrow. And the courage to keep showing up even when you tell me to leave. From the hallway, small footsteps padded toward them. Lucas stood in the kitchen doorway, his dinosaur pajamas rumpled, Barnaby the elephant clutched under one arm. His eyes, so deeply Alexander's, blinked sleepily between his parents. "Mama sad," he murmured, taking a hesitant step forward. Isabella immediately wiped her tears, forcing a smile. "No, my love. Mama's just talking." Lucas looked at Alexander, then at the untouched mug of tea. He toddled over and placed his small hand on Alexander's knee, the same gesture he'd made hours earlier on the ballroom rug. "Daddy sad too," he announced with the certainty of children who see truth adults hide. Then he reached for Alexander's mug, took a tiny sip, and made a face. Bitter. The absurdity of it, the profound sweetness of his son tasting his tea and declaring it bitter, unlocked something in Alexander. A laugh escaped him, wet with tears. "It is bitter, buddy. But sometimes bitter things help us sleep." Lucas considered this with solemn wisdom. Then he climbed onto Alexander's lap without asking, without hesitation, resting his head against his father's chest as if he'd done it every night of his life. Isabella watched, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the moment she'd feared and longed for in equal measure, her son's instinctive trust bypassing 3 years of absence, as if love were a language written in the bones, not the calendar. Alexander held his son in his arms, breathing against his heart, and looked at Isabella over Lucas's dark curls. His eyes held no defensiveness now, only raw, unvarnished truth. "I don't expect you to welcome me back with open arms," he whispered. "But I'm asking, begging, for the chance to earn a chair at this table. Not as your husband. Not yet. But as Lucas's father. However you'll have me." Lucas stirred in his arms, mumbling sleepily. "Stay. Tell Lion's story." Isabella's breath caught. She looked from her son's trusting face to Alexander's tear-streaked one. The man who had shattered her heart now holding their child with a reverence that felt like redemption. "The guest room is made up," she said softly, the words hanging between them like a fragile bridge. "Down the hall. The blue door." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a single, trembling thread thrown across the chasm of 3 years. A thread Alexander would have to grasp with both hands and hold with everything he had. He nodded, his throat too tight for words. As he rose carefully with Lucas in his arms, the boy's small hand found his tie again. This time not to tug, but to hold on. And as Alexander carried his son down the hall toward a room with a blue door, he understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding, that coming home isn't a single moment of arrival. It's the courage to show up night after night after night, listening to the creak of floorboards as Isabella checked on Lucas, to the distant hum of the refrigerator, to the city waking beyond the brownstone walls. Every sound was a thread weaving him back into a life he'd abandoned. At 5:47 a.m., a small voice echoed down the hall, "Mama, sun up." He rose quietly, his suit rumpled from hours of sitting upright in an armchair. In the hallway, he paused outside Lucas's half-open door. Isabella knelt beside the crib, her voice a gentle melody as she wiped sleep from their son's eyes with a damp cloth. "Good morning, my love. Did you dream about lions again?" Lucas nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Lion Daddy stayed." Isabella's hands stilled for a heartbeat. Then she pressed a kiss to his forehead. "He did. And now it's time for breakfast." Banana pancakes. Alexander stepped back into the shadows, his throat tight. He watched as she lifted Lucas into her arms. Effortless, practiced, the child's head nestling into the curve of her neck, as if it had always belonged there. This was the rhythm he'd missed, not the grand milestones, but the sacred ordinary. The way she knew he liked his banana pancakes slightly burnt at the edges. The way she hummed the same off-key lullaby while brushing his teeth. Downstairs, the kitchen filled with the scent of batter hitting a hot griddle. Alexander lingered in the doorway, unseen. Isabella moved with a grace born of necessity, balancing Lucas on her hip while flipping pancakes, wiping syrup from his chin with her sleeve, laughing when he attempted to feed Barnaby the elephant a bite of banana. This was her empire, not built in boardrooms, but in flour-dusted aprons and sticky fingers and the quiet courage of facing each day alone. "You can come in," she said without turning, her voice soft. "He's been asking for you since he woke up." Alexander stepped into the warm light. Lucas's face lit up instantly. "Daddy Lion," he chirped, patting the empty chair beside him. "Pancakes." Isabella placed a plate before Alexander. 3 perfectly golden pancakes, a single strawberry on the side. His favorite. She'd remembered. "He only eats if someone makes the smiley face with blueberries," she murmured, arranging fruit on Lucas's plate with practiced fingers. "Otherwise, he says the pancakes are sad." As Lucas chattered about a dream involving flying elephants, Alexander watched Isabella's hands. The faint scar on her thumb, the chipped polish on her nails, the way she never stopped moving, refilling milk, wiping syrup, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. This was the truth he'd avoided for 3 years. Single motherhood wasn't a tragedy to be pitted. It was a relentless, beautiful act of creation performed daily without applause. When Lucas finally slid from his chair to play with toy cars on the rug, Isabella finally looked at Alexander fully. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden. The fine lines around her eyes weren't from sorrow, but from 3 years of smiling through exhaustion. The strength in her shoulders wasn't hardness. It was the architecture of resilience. "You want to know what it was like?" she asked quietly, wiping the table with a cloth. The challenges. He nodded, unable to speak. She gestured to the kitchen window, where frost still clung to the pane. "Last winter, Lucas had pneumonia. 104 degrees fever at midnight. I carried him 10 blocks through snow because my car wouldn't start." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the cloth. "I sat in the emergency room holding him against my chest for 6 hours, rocking him while nurses came and went. And the whole time, I kept thinking, this is what he deserves. 2 arms to hold him. Not just one." Alexander's breath caught. "Why didn't you call me? My number was disconnected after you changed it following the merger," she finished softly. "I tried, Alexander. For 6 months, I called every number I could find. Your office said you were unavailable indefinitely. Your assistant stopped returning my messages after the 3rd month." She looked toward Lucas, now lining up toy cars with intense concentration. "I stopped asking for help when I realized no one was listening." The truth settled over him like ash. Marcus hadn't just intercepted messages. He'd systematically erased Alexander from their lives, exploiting his absence to consolidate power. And Alexander had been too proud, too wounded, to fight his way back through the silence. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words inadequate. "I swear to you, Isabella, I didn't know." "I believe you," she said, and the simple trust in her voice undid him completely. "That's what terrifies me. I still believe you. After everything." Lucas toddled over then, holding up a red toy car. "Daddy, drive." Alexander's vision blurred. He reached for the car, his large hand engulfing his son's small one as they pushed it across the rug together. "Virum," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Virum, buddy." Isabella knelt beside them, her shoulder brushing Alexander's. Not intentionally, just proximity. But the contact sent a current through him, a recognition that some fractures, though deep, might still hold the weight of a future. "He started talking late," she murmured, watching Lucas guide the car around an imaginary track. "Didn't say his first real word until he was 22 months. The pediatrician said it was normal for boys. But I'd lie awake wondering if it was because he only heard one voice all day. If silence had stolen his words before he even learned them." Alexander looked at his son speaking in full sentences now, offering toy cars and clay birds, and felt the magnitude of what she'd carried alone. "What was his first word?" he asked softly. Isabella's eyes glistened. "Mama. Of course. A faint smile touched her lips. But his second word was Dada. He said it to the photograph I kept on my nightstand. The one from our wedding day. He'd pat the glass and say Dada, like he was trying to wake you up." Alexander's composure shattered. Tears streamed freely down his face as Lucas looked up, concerned. "Daddy said no, buddy," Alexander choked out, pulling his son gently into his lap. "Daddy's just happy. Happier than he's ever been." Lucas studied his face with solemn wisdom. Then he reached up and wiped Alexander's tears with his small thumb. The same gesture Isabella had used moments earlier. "Okay," Lucas whispered. "No sad." In that simple act of comfort, from son to father, mirroring mother to son, Alexander understood the circle of love he'd broken and might still mend. Not through grand gestures or billion-dollar donations, but through mornings like this one. Through burnt pancakes and toy cars and the courage to sit in a kitchen where he'd once belonged and prove, day by day, that he could belong again. Isabella watched them, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's shoulder. A touch so brief he almost missed it, but it carried the weight of 3 years of waiting. And in that touch, he heard the question that would define everything moving forward. "Can you stay?" He looked at his son's trusting face. "At the woman who had built a home from you," said Marcus Croft manipulated the photo. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's more, isn't there? You wouldn't have stayed away this long just because of one fake image." Alexander's breath caught. He'd rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in Singapore hotel rooms. But now the words felt inadequate against the weight of what he'd cost them. Marcus didn't just send the photo, he admitted, his gaze dropping to his hands. Hands that had signed documents giving Marcus increasing control while Alexander was blinded by grief. He engineered everything. The timing of the Singapore merger demand. The anonymous messages to both of us. Even the leaked boardroom rumors about my softening focus. He looked up, his eyes raw with shame. He knew I'd choose pride over vulnerability. He counted on it. Isabella went very still. Why? Because my father's will stipulated that if I abandoned my family before Lucas turned 5, my voting shares would transfer to the board, with Marcus as majority holder. The truth hung between them, ugly and precise. He needed me to walk away voluntarily. A divorce wouldn't have triggered it, but abandonment would. A single tear traced Isabella's cheek. Not of anger, but of dawning horror. All this time, I thought you chose ambition over us. But you were manipulated into believing I'd betrayed you. I was too proud to verify the truth, Alexander choked out. Too wounded to pick up the phone and ask you directly. And Marcus knew that about me. He'd studied my weaknesses for 15 years. He reached into his suit jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded document that had traveled with him across oceans. I discovered the full scheme 6 months ago. Security footage from Marcus's office showing him altering the photo. Email trails proving he fabricated the board's ultimatum about Singapore. His hands trembled as he smoothed the paper on the table. I confronted him quietly, removed him from the company without scandal. But by then 3 years had passed, Isabella finished softly. She picked up the document, her eyes scanning the evidence. Timestamps, metadata, Marcus's damning digital fingerprints. You could have sent this to me. You could have called. I tried, he whispered, tears spilling freely now. I drafted 100 messages. Sat outside this neighborhood for hours one night last spring, watching your windows from a parked car. His voice broke. But what could I possibly say after 987 days of silence? Sorry I believed a lie. Sorry I missed his first steps. Words felt like insults to what you'd endured alone. Lucas toddled back into the kitchen then, holding up a crayon drawing. A wobbly lion with 3 figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. He placed it carefully on the table between his parents. For sad, he announced with solemn certainty. Make happy. Isabella's composure shattered. She pulled Lucas onto her lap, burying her face in his hair as silent sobs racked her shoulders. Not tears of anger, but of release. 3 years of carrying the weight alone. 3 years of wondering if she'd somehow failed. 3 years of protecting her son from the truth, while secretly grieving the man she'd loved. Alexander knelt beside them, his hand hovering just above Isabella's back. A question, not an assumption. When she didn't pull away, he rested his palm gently between her shoulder blades, feeling the fragile architecture of her strength beneath his touch. I should have fought harder, he murmured, his voice thick with tears. When I saw that photo, I should have called you screaming. I should have driven to Vermont that night and stood on your porch until you opened the door. But I was terrified. If the photo was real, I'd have to face that you'd chosen someone else. And if it was fake, I'd have to face that I'd almost believed it anyway. He looked at Lucas, tracing the curve of his son's cheek with infinite tenderness. My father taught me that vulnerability is weakness. That real men don't beg. And for 38 years, I believed him. Until I realized the strongest thing I'd ever witnessed was you. Building a beautiful life from nothing but love and absence. Isabella lifted her head, her eyes glistening with a mixture of grief and dawning understanding. We were both trapped, she whispered. You by pride, me by silence. And Marcus Croft held the key to both our cages. From the hallway, the apartment door creaked open. Both parents tensed instinctively, but it was only Clara, Isabella's sister, carrying grocery bags. She froze in the doorway, taking in the scene, Alexander kneeling beside Isabella and Lucas. Tears on all their faces, the incriminating document spread across the kitchen table. Oh, Clara breathed, setting down her bags. So it's today. Isabella managed a watery smile. It's today. Clara approached slowly, her gaze softening as she studied Alexander. Not as the tycoon from tabloids, but as the man holding her nephew with hands that trembled with reverence. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. For 3 years, my sister has defended you to everyone who asked, Clara said quietly. Teachers at Lucas's school. Neighbors who whispered. Even our mother, who wanted to hire a lawyer the day you left. She knelt beside him, her eyes holding his with unwavering directness. She never let anyone call you a deadbeat. Never let Lucas think you didn't love him. She said, his father is lost right now. But love always finds its way home. Clara's voice broke slightly. She believed that when no one else did. Even when she didn't believe it herself. Alexander's breath caught. He looked at Isabella, really looked, and saw the truth in Clara's words. This woman had carried not just their son, but the fragile flame of hope that he might still return worthy of them. I have a safe deposit box at Chase, he said suddenly, the words tumbling out. It's been open since the day I left Vermont. Inside is a letter I wrote to Lucas the night you closed the door. I've added to it every month. First steps I missed, jokes I'd tell him, promises I'd keep if given the chance. His voice dropped to a whisper. And a trust fund. Not the corporate kind. A handwritten note saying every dollar is for his art supplies, his college dreams, his freedom to choose a life built on joy, not obligation. Isabella's hand found his where it rested on the table. Her fingers intertwined with his. Not as lovers reclaiming what was lost, but as co-parents forging a new foundation from the rubble of the old. We can't undo 3 years, she said softly. But we can build something new from this truth. Starting with telling Lucas the real story. Not of a father who left, but of a father who got lost and fought his way back. As if on cue, Lucas looked up from his drawing, his small face serious. Daddy lost. Alexander's throat tightened. He pulled his son gently onto his lap, cradling him with a reverence that felt sacred. Yes, buddy. Daddy got very lost. But Mama kept a light on for me. And you built me a map with clay birds and block towers. He pressed a kiss to Lucas's hair, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and hope. And now I'm home. Outside the window, church bells began to chime, 11 clear notes hanging in the crisp morning air. A new hour. A new beginning. And in the quiet kitchen filled with the ghosts of 3 lost years and the fragile promise of what might still grow, Alexander Vance finally understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding, that the strongest empires aren't built on pride or power, but on the courage to kneel on a kitchen floor and whisper 3 words that change everything. I was wrong. Isabella's tears fell freely now. Not tears of sorrow, but of witnessing a man finally choosing love over legacy. And as Lucas reached up to wipe his father's tears with a syrup-sticky hand, the circle of their broken family began, at last, to mend. Not with a dramatic reunion, but with the quiet, trembling architecture of truth, block by block, breath by breath, in the sacred ordinary of a sunlit kitchen on a blue crayon. Isabella watched them both, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's knee. A touch so simple it carried the weight of 3 years of waiting. I need to finish this, Alexander whispered, not moving from his chair. Not for revenge. For peace. Isabella nodded slowly. Marcus is still on the board. He's been interim CEO since you left Singapore. A cold understanding settled between them. Marcus hadn't just stolen Alexander's company. He'd been living in the life Alexander abandoned, wearing his title like a stolen suit. That afternoon, while Lucas napped and Isabella graded student artwork at the kitchen table, Alexander sat cross-legged on the living room rug surrounded by documents. His phone glowed with a video call to Eleanor Reed, the board chairwoman who'd once demanded he choose between family and empire. Alexander Vance, she said, her voice sharp with surprise. The prodigal son returns. I'm not here to reclaim my throne, Eleanor, he said quietly, Lucas's crayon drawing of their 3-handed family resting beside his laptop. I'm here to expose a thief. For 20 minutes, he laid out the evidence. Security footage of Marcus altering the photo in his office, email trails showing fabricated board demands, financial records proving Marcus had been siphoning funds into offshore accounts under the guise of merger expenses. Eleanor's stern expression gradually softened into something resembling shame. I suspected something was wrong, she admitted finally, her gaze dropping. The numbers never quite added up. But I told myself a man who abandons his pregnant wife lacks the character to lead anyway. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes glistening. I was wrong about you, Alexander. And I failed you when you needed the board's support. In Marcus's broken confession, he'd found something unexpected, not an enemy to defeat, but a wounded man to release. The real victory wasn't reclaiming his company. It was discovering he no longer needed to win to feel whole. That afternoon, the boardroom vote was unanimous. Alexander Vance was reinstated as CEO. But when Eleanor Reed handed him the ceremonial gavel, he set it gently aside. I'm not returning as CEO, he announced, his voice calm but firm. I'm appointing Clara Reyes, Isabella's sister, a cybersecurity expert who helped uncover this fraud as interim CEO. I'll remain on the board as chairman, but my priority is elsewhere. He looked toward the window, toward Brooklyn, toward a brownstone with flower boxes and a blue door. Some legacies aren't built in boardrooms. They're built at kitchen tables. And I've missed enough breakfasts. As he left the tower for the last time, not as a defeated man, but as a transformed one, the elevator descended through floors of glass and steel toward the streets below, toward a life measured not in stock prices, but in pancake breakfasts and clay birds and the sacred ordinary of showing up. And for the first time since boarding that plane to Singapore 3 years ago, Alexander Vance felt not the weight of an empire on his shoulders, but the lightness of a second chance, fragile as a spiderweb, precious as breath. Waiting to be woven into Alexander knelt, pulling his son into an embrace that felt less like reunion and more like coming home to a truth he'd almost missed forever. "I'm back, buddy. For good." Isabella stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour. Her gaze held his, not with suspicion now, but with a quiet assessment. She'd seen the news alerts flashing on her phone an hour ago. Vance Technologies CEO steps down. Founder returns as chairman. She knew what it meant. He'd chosen them over the throne. That evening, as Lucas bathed and chattered about Daddy Lion, Alexander found Isabella on the fire escape, the city lights beginning to glitter below. He handed her a steaming mug of chamomile, her favorite, and sat beside her on the worn wooden slats. "I decline the CEO position," he said softly. "Appointed Clara interim. I'll stay on the board part-time. Enough to protect what we built, not enough to miss bedtime stories." She wrapped her hands around the mug, her shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. "Why, after everything you sacrificed to build that company? Because I finally understand the difference between building something that lasts and building something that matters." He turned to her, the sunset catching the unshed tears in his eyes. "Vance Technologies will survive without me. But Lucas only gets one childhood. And I've already missed 1,000 sunsets." Inside, Lucas's laughter floated through the screen door, a sound so pure it felt like grace. Isabella's breath caught. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of their son's questions alone. Now here was the man who'd walked away, offering not excuses, but presence. 2 days later, Alexander received an unexpected invitation: the Oakwood School's monthly community circle, a gathering of parents, teachers, and neighbors sharing stories over tea and cookies. Isabella had mentioned it casually over breakfast. "You don't have to come," she'd said, buttering toast for Lucas. "But the kids would love to see you again." He'd agreed without hesitation. Now, sitting cross-legged on a rainbow rug beside Lucas, Alexander watched children share drawings and parents speak of small triumphs. A kindergartner learning to tie shoes, a third grader overcoming shyness to read aloud. When the facilitator asked if anyone else wished to share, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, the tycoon who'd knelt on this very rug building block towers with his son. Alexander's throat tightened. He could offer a donation, a corporate partnership, the easy currency of wealth. Instead, he took a shaky breath and spoke from a place rawer than any boardroom. "A few days ago," he began, his voice softer than the children were used to hearing from adults, "I learned something important about second chances." Lucas looked up from his crayons, sensing the shift in his father's tone. "I spent 3 years believing I'd lost my family because of a lie someone told me. But the truth is, I lost them because I was too afraid to pick up the phone and ask if the lie was true." He looked directly at Isabella, who sat watching him with glistening eyes. "Fear makes us choose pride over love every time. And pride builds very tall walls, but they're walls you have to live behind alone." A little girl raised her hand. "Did you get your family back?" Alexander's gaze returned to Lucas, who'd crawled into his lap without a word, resting his head against his father's chest. "I'm learning how," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "One morning of burnt pancakes at a time. One bedtime story. One block tower that falls down and gets built again." He looked around the circle, at parents who'd known struggle, teachers who'd chosen purpose over profit, children who saw the world in colors adults had forgotten. "We talk about forgiveness like it's something you give someone. But real forgiveness, it's something you build together. Brick by brick. Even when your hands are shaking." Tears streamed freely down Isabella's cheeks now, but she made no move to hide them. In that moment, she saw not the tycoon who'd left her pregnant, but the man who'd finally understood that empires built on absence crumble faster than those built on.